The chapel doors groaned open at dawn. Cold air swept through the palace of Pamplona. Stone pillars loomed like watchmen, their shadows clinging even as pale light spilled through narrow windows. At the centre walked Elvira, 12 years old, a queen in name, a child in truth. Her white bridal veil trembled like breath on glass. Each step caught the silence. Each drag of fabric against the floor echoed louder than words. The courtiers said nothing. No laughter, no whispers, only the scrape of sandals against stone. Her veil brushed the flagstones like a shroud laid too early. At the altar waited Sancho, her brother, 14 years old, crowned in crimson velvet. The boy wore duty like a mask, his crown gleaming faintly in the dim light, his face caught between childhood and command. Archbishop Ramiro lifted his jewelled cross. Tall, austere, his voice rolled through the vaulted chapel. Each word struck like iron on iron. He named Elvira not as sister, not as child, but as wife. He declared what God had never written. Elvira's hand shook as he placed it into Sancho's. Her veil slipped forward, half blinding her. No one moved to lift it. She searched Sancho's eyes through the gauze, dark curls framing a face that looked away. His grip was rigid. Not love, not comfort, only cold obedience. And silence deepened, as though the very stones had agreed to guard the secret forever. Her crown tilted, too large for the head beneath it. She felt its weight pressing sharp against her scalp. Ramiro's prayers bound her voice tighter than any chain. Somewhere in the shadows a woman sobbed, but the sound was swallowed before it could reach her. Every eye in the chapel saw a queen. Every heart knew it was still a child beneath that veil. If this was the fate of a queen, what chance did ordinary women have? The bells outside rang with false joy. Inside, the air thickened with silence. Sancho stood rigid, his hand cool as stone. Elvira's silence was not command. It was surrender. The silence of a bird caged too soon. Her gown glittered with gold thread on ivory silk. From afar it looked radiant. To her it felt like iron. The veil, soft as silk, became a curtain. It dimmed the world. It hid the tears forming at the edges of her eyes. Ramiro's blessing rang above them. His jewelled cross glinted, trembling slightly in his grip. Was it conviction? Or doubt breaking through his voice? Still. The words did not falter. When Sancho leaned forward to press his brow against hers, the veil brushed between them. Brother and sister, husband and wife. Breath mingled, but no warmth passed. The veil had become a wall, fragile, transparent, unbreakable. One by one the courtiers lowered their eyes, as if erasing the sight from memory. No one spoke of love. No one spoke of God. Only silence reigned in the stone chapel, heavy as the crown on Elvira's head. And so, in the early spring of 1402, in Pamplona's palace chapel, Elvira, child queen of a Navarre, was bound by veil, bound by crown, bound by silence itself. The vows were finished, but her story had only just begun. The chapel still smelled of incense. Ash clung to the air, heavy as the prayers that had been spoken only moments before. Elvira, 12 years old, stood motionless, her veil now lifted from her face. For a heartbeat she felt the air on her skin, but when she looked up she did not see freedom. She saw Sancho, her brother, her husband. The vows still rang in the rafters, steel in Archbishop Ramiro's voice. He had spoken them with no tremor, no hesitation. Each syllable sealed the silence more tightly around her. She had been named wife, yet she was still only a child. Her veil had been lifted, but it revealed no salvation, only a brother's face stiff with duty. Sancho stood tall in his crimson tunic, the weight of a gilded crown pressing his young brow. His dark eyes gave nothing back, no warmth, no pity. The vows had taken that from him. What remained was a wall of obedience, and Elvira felt herself pressed against it, unable to breathe. At the edge of the chamber, Aldara, her nurse and confidant, watched in silence. Her hands twisted around the wooden rosary at her waist. She dared not speak, dared not cry out, but her eyes clung to Elvira's as if to remind her, "You are still seen." It was the only comfort she could give in that vaulted hall of stone. Archbishop Ramiro lowered his cross, his voice still echoing in memory. He turned away, robes sweeping like black wings, and left the children to the weight of their binding. To him, it was God's will. To Elvira, it was a prison, one she'd stepped into before she could even choose her words. The courtiers began to leave the chapel. One by one they bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in complicity. No one had spoken against the vows. No one would. Their silence was the truest law of the court of Navarre. Elvira's veil was folded carefully and placed upon the ceremonial bed in the adjoining chamber. White silk embroidered with golden thread, a symbol of purity, now transformed into a mark of possession. The fabric shimmered in the lamplight, but to Elvira it looked like a net, waiting to fall again. Sancho followed her into the chamber, his steps slow, deliberate. He carried no words, only the rigid stance of a prince who had been taught that silence was strength. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the folded veil. For a moment he seemed as trapped by it as she was. Elvira stood beside him, her small hands clutching the folds of her gown. The gold embroidery scratched her palms. She wanted to ask him, why? Why could they not remain brother and sister, children still? But her lips parted and no sound came. Silence had been trained into her like breath. Spring winds rattled the shutters of the palace chamber. Outside, Pamplona blossomed with new life. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick with vows that could never be unsaid. Archbishop Ramiro's voice still haunted the chamber. Each phrase he had spoken replayed in Elvira's mind like a chain dragged across stone. She wondered if God had heard those vows, or if heaven had turned its face away. Sancho leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He glanced once at Elvira, then away. His silence was not cruel, but it was cold. She realized with a hollow ache that he too was bound, trapped in duty, shaped by voices louder than his own. Aldara lingered in the doorway, her presence a shadow of comfort. Her eyes pleaded with Elvira to endure, to hold on to the small flame of herself still burning beneath the veil. But Aldara's lips never moved. Not here. Not where walls had ears. The veil lay folded between them, white and perfect, yet already stained with meanings that could not be washed away. It had been a symbol of innocence. Now it was a reminder of chains. The bed glowed softly in the torchlight, its sheets untouched, its silence unbearable. In the spring of 1402, in the palace of Pamplona, Elvira, the child queen of Navarre, stood beside her brother husband Sancho. Their marriage was not salvation, it was a sentence, and as the veil waited on the bed, so too did the weight of what was to come. The weeks after the wedding passed like a blur of ritual. Elvira, the child queen of Navarre, no longer walked as a girl. She was carried by the weight of titles she could not yet understand. The crown gleamed upon her brow at every gathering. Gold, polished until it caught the torchlight like fire. Yet beneath its shine was the bite of iron, pressing into her scalp until every movement ached. The crown looked glorious. It felt like punishment. At court, voices swelled with politics, but none with compassion. Nobles bowed, murmured praises, then turned away. They admired the glitter, never the girl beneath it. Elvira sat among them, silent, her small frame stiff in ivory gowns embroidered with the lions of Navarre. She had been taught to sit straight, to smile when spoken of, and to let silence carry her through the hall like a veil she could not shed. Sancho, her brother and now husband, grew colder with each passing day. At feasts he sat at her side, but his eyes stayed fixed on the banners above, on the goblets, on the nobles who sought his favour, rarely on her. When his gaze did fall upon Elvira, it was not the gaze of a brother, not even of a husband. It was the gaze of a prince fulfilling his duty, a silence harder than words. Aldara lingered in the shadows, her nurse's eyes sharp with worry. She noted every pallor on Elvira's cheeks, every tremor in her hands. But Aldara too was bound, her loyalty chained by the danger of speaking aloud. So she pressed her wooden rosary tight and let her silence speak what her lips could not. Lord Martin, adviser to the court, wrote endlessly. His quill scratched across parchment, recording treaties, alliances, petitions from merchants, grievances of nobles. But he never recorded Elvira's tears, never the way her crown slid down and cut into her temples. To Martin, history was made of ink and seals, not the pain of children hidden behind gilded walls. The crown remained her constant burden. By day it glistened at court, by night it was placed upon the small table beside her bed. Elvira would stare at it in the lamplight, gold catching shadows, jewels gleaming like watching eyes. It was meant to signify power. Instead, it became a sentinel, a reminder that silence was now her throne. Weeks turned to months. Whispers crept through the palace corridors. Some murmured that Elvira was too frail, too young to bear the role thrust upon her. Others whispered of Sancho, his coldness, his detachment, his unease. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with rumour, but none dared to speak above a whisper. Elvira heard them, though. Each hushed word was like a thorn pressed into her skin. She sat straighter. She held her silence. But inside, she felt the crown tightening, pressing, bending her beneath its weight. One evening, as the spring rains battered the palace windows, Elvira removed the crown and set it down beside her bed. The chamber was quiet, save for the drops of water against stone. Sancho stood at the window staring into the storm. Aldara waited by the door, lips pressed together, her eyes rimmed with worry. Lord Martin's quill scratched faintly in a chamber nearby, writing lines that would never hold her name. Elvira lay back against her pillow, staring at the crown on the table. It shone brilliantly in the lamplight, but its shine felt mocking. Her head felt lighter without it, yet her chest heavier still. The crown had given her silence in the hall, but now it followed her even into her dreams, and as the rains washed the night outside, the child Queen of Navarre felt the storm gather within her too. Not a storm of words, but of silence so sharp it cut deeper than sound. The summer air pressed heavy against the stone walls of Pamplona's palace. Heat gathered in the narrow corridors, thick as smoke, refusing to lift. Within the Queen's inner quarters, Elvira sat by the window, her frame small against the rising sun. She was barely 13, her skin pale, her breath shallow, her hands folded over the swell that had begun to betray her silence. The court did not speak of it aloud, but the whispers flowed like water through cracks in stone. Some called it hope for the bloodline, others behind closed doors called it forbidden, a brother's child, a queen's curse. Elvira felt the weight growing inside her with every day. It was not joy, not the song of life. It was heaviness, pressing her ribs, draining her strength. She walked more slowly now, her body faltering under the weight of a crown no longer on her head, but within her womb. Aldara watched with frightened eyes. She had raised Elvira from the cradle, whispered lullabies into her ears. Now she watched the child queen falter with each step across the chamber floor. Aldara clutched her wooden rosary until her fingers ached. Each bead dug into her skin like thorns. She prayed for strength, prayed for mercy, but in her heart she feared. The child might never breathe, and if it did, what curse would it carry? Elvira leaned against Aldara when the pain grew sharp. Her veil had long been folded away, but another veil, the veil of secrecy, covered the palace more tightly than silk. No courtier spoke openly, no scribe dared to write, but servants carried whispers from corridor to corridor. This will end badly. They should have never allowed it. God will judge. Archbishop Ramiro came often. His black robe swept across the chamber like a shadow. He spoke of duty, of obedience, of sacrifice for the crown of Navarre. His jewelled cross glittered in the torchlight as his voice cut the air. "This is God's design," he said, though his eyes flickered once, betraying something unsaid. To him, the child was not Elvira's suffering. It was the survival of a dynasty. Elvira bowed her head when he spoke. She said nothing. Her silence had become her armour, though it was an armour that bruised her from within. Sancho, her brother husband, grew more distant with every passing week. He appeared at her side in public, hand resting lightly on hers. But when the chamber doors closed, he vanished into silence. His absence pressed against her more than his presence ever had, and still the whispers clung to her name, marking her not as queen, but as vessel. Lord Martin recorded the politics of Navarre with tireless precision. Treaties sealed, alliances drafted. He wrote of trade, of land disputes, of noble quarrels. But not once did his ink capture the tremor of Elvira's hands, or the hollow fear in her eyes when the midwives whispered at night. He looked away from the truth, choosing paper and ink over the cries no one wanted to hear. Aldara alone remained constant. Each night she sat at the child queen's bedside, rosary pressed to her lips, whispering prayers too soft for the guards to hear. When Elvira stirred, Aldara's hand reached to steady her. When she wept silently, Aldara's tears fell unseen in the dark. By midsummer, the palace walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. The gardens bloomed outside, but within Elvira's chambers the air was stifled, smothered by secrecy. The child queen of Navarre had become both throne and tomb. Every step she took echoed like prophecy. Every silence grew heavier. Elvira lay in her chamber as the bells tolled faintly across Pamplona. Her crown was gone from her head, but the true crown sat within her, pressing, burning, binding her to a fate she could not escape. She reached once toward Aldara's rosary, fingers brushing the wooden beads. She wanted to pray, but no words came, only silence. And in that silence the whispers gathered, spreading like smoke through the court, warning of a fire that had already been lit. The midsummer heat clung to the birthing chamber like a curse. No breeze reached the windows. The air was thick with sweat, smoke and fear. On the narrow bed lay Elvira, child queen of Navarre, barely 13. Her body writhed beneath linen sheets, each cry tearing through the stone walls as though the palace itself could feel her agony. Her white veil, once folded in innocence, had been dragged forward to shield her face. Now it slipped loose, half torn, catching in her fists as she clutched at the pain. Aldara knelt at her side, tears streaking her face. The wooden rosary slipped in her trembling hands, beads slick with sweat. She whispered prayers too frantic to follow, each plea tangled with Elvira's screams. At the threshold stood Sancho, brother, husband, Prince of Navarre. He didn't cross the doorway. His shadow stretched across the floor, but his body stayed rigid, his hand gripping the iron latch as though it held him upright. His face was pale, drawn between fear and duty. He listened, but he did not move. Archbishop Ramiro loomed near the bed, robes black as night. His jewelled cross caught the torchlight, burning coldly against the chamber's gloom. He lifted it high, his voice chanting words that did not tremble. He prayed not for Elvira's body, not for her pain, but for the bloodline of Navarre. His voice clashed with her screams, holy syllables against raw human sound. Each cry from Elvira shattered the prayers. Yet Ramiro went on, eyes closed, lips moving steadily, as though we could drown a child suffering beneath ritual. Chamber swelled with sound. Elvira's voice, breaking, raw. Aldara's sobs, desperate, pleading. Ramiro's chant, steady as iron. And from the hall beyond, the silence of Sancho, rigid as stone. The child queen's body bent and buckled, her hands clawed at the veil until the fabric tore, threads ripping beneath her fingers. She dragged the torn silk across her chest, soaked now in sweat and the red of suffering. Her eyes rolled toward Aldara. For a heartbeat she looked only like a child again, the same child Aldara had cradled years before crowns, before vows. But there was no lullaby now, only the storm of labour and the shadow of death crouched at the bed. Outside, the bells of Pamplona tolled faintly, mocking the silence of the palace halls. Courtiers waited in hushed groups, pretending not to hear the cries that rose and fell like waves against the walls. They spoke of lineage, of God's will, of dynastic strength. But none dared to speak of the girl on the bed, the girl whose body was breaking before their eyes. Aldara's rosary fell to the floor. She did not notice. Her hands pressed against Elvira's, her lips whispering comfort, though her tears betrayed the truth. She feared no comfort could hold against this storm. Ramiro's voice grew louder. His cross trembled above the girl's writhing frame. He prayed as though the child within her mattered more than the queen herself. The words rose like chains, binding the chamber in ritual, leaving Elvira's cries as the only voice of rebellion. At the threshold, Sancho lowered his head into his hands. He pressed his brow against the wood, his body frozen between the chamber and the hall. He could not step forward. He could not step away. Every cry pierced him, yet still he stood in silence. And within the chamber, the veil dropped from Elvira's hand. It fell to the floor, torn, stained, a pale ghost of innocence, soaked now in the raw truth of suffering. No longer a symbol of purity. Now it was a witness. The storm did not relent. Hour bled into hour. The torches smoked, the air stifled, and still the child queen's body fought against itself. Her voice broke, her chest heaved, her hands flailed against the sheets. Aldara's cries joined hers. Ramiro's prayers rose higher. Sancho's silence deepened. And as the veil lay on the floor, silent and torn, the fate of Navarre trembled with every scream. The chamber was silent at last. The midsummer storm had broken, leaving only the stillness of late August heat. On the narrow bed lay Elvira, the child queen of Navarre. Her chest no longer rose. Her lips, parted as if to cry, released nothing. At her side, wrapped in linen, lay the infant that never breathed. The room reeked of smoke and sweat. The remnants of candles burned down to stubs. The veil was gone. The sheets were still damp from the struggle, and on the floor, where it had slipped from trembling hands, the gilded crown lay abandoned. It had rolled to rest at the edge of the bed, its gold dulled, its jewels staring upward like eyes that could not close. Aldara clung to the wooden rosary at her breast, her knuckles white, her lips cracked from prayers whispered too long. She sat at the foot of the bed, rocking gently as though rocking the dead child itself. Her tears fell silently, darkening the linen. She had feared this ending, yet to see it, to see the small girl she had once cradled, broken on a bed she never chose, was a wound that prayer could not seal. Sancho stood at the threshold again, the same threshold where he had waited hours before. His face was drawn, hollowed by silence. He did not cross into the chamber. He stared at Elvira's body, and the weight of his crown pressed heavier than the gold that lay abandoned by her bed. He did not weep, but his jaw clenched until blood drained from his lips. Archbishop Ramiro stood rigid near the window. His jewelled cross still dangled in his hand, but for the first time his voice had faltered. No prayer spilled from his lips now. His eyes lingered on the stillborn child, then on Elvira's body. And for a breath, even he seemed shaken. But he turned away quickly, cloaking doubt in silence, as though to name the tragedy would unravel the vows he had once spoken. Lord Martin entered quietly, parchment tucked beneath his arm. His quill scratched as he made the record. The Queen is dead. The child stillborn. No mention of age. No mention of suffering. No ink for screams, for torn veils, for a body broken in the service of silence. Martin's hand did not tremble. The record would carry no grief, only the cold strokes of history. The chamber smelled of endings. The torches hissed as they burned low, casting faint shadows across Elvira's face. She looked younger in death than she had in life, as if the weight of duty had finally slipped away with a breath. Her hands rested open upon the sheets, small, pale, childlike once more. Aldara leaned forward, pressing her lips to Elvira's forehead. Her tears wet the skin, already cooling. She whispered a lullaby she'd sung years before, when Elvira had been no more than a girl chasing light in the palace gardens. Now the song was a farewell. The beads of the rosary clicked in her fingers with each verse, a rhythm against grief. Sancho shifted at the doorway, his crown heavy on his head. He looked once more at the golden circlet abandoned on the floor, its jewels flickering faintly in the dying torchlight. It seemed to accuse him, to remind him that crowns were made for men, yet it was a child who had borne its weight unto death. He turned his face away, and with that motion the silence grew deeper. In the late summer of 1402, in Pamplona's palace chamber, the court of Navarre witnessed its queen reduced to a line in Martin's record. Elvira was gone. The child she carried was gone. And all that remained was silence. The crown stayed where it had fallen, not upon her brow, not upon his, but on the floor near her bed, untouched, unwanted, a relic of a duty that had devoured its bearer. Autumn settled over Pamplona with a chill that clung to the courtyards. The wind swept dry leaves across the stones, rattling them like bones. Within the palace walls silence reigned. The cries that had once shaken the chambers were gone, but their echo lingered, faint as breath on glass. Elvira was dead, barely 13. Her body buried beneath marble, her name spoken in whispers that dwindled with each passing week. The court shifted quickly, as though she had never been more than a line in a ledger, a pawn already played and forgotten. But her absence haunted those who had stood closest. Sancho walked the courtyards with hollow eyes. The crown rested on his head now, polished and bright, but his face bore the shadows of sleepless nights. He didn't speak of Elvira, not to his advisors, not to Aldara, not to himself. Her name lay on his lips like a thorn, too sharp to hold, too dangerous to release. When he stood at the balcony overlooking Pamplona, the autumn winds tore at his cloak. Once that balcony had been her favourite place. Now he avoided its edge, yet always found himself drawn back to it, as though the wind itself carried her memory. Aldara moved through the palace halls more slowly now. Her rosary clung to her fingers like a chain she could not release. The beads were worn smooth, rubbed raw by nights of desperate prayer. She still visited the chamber where Elvira had died, sitting beside the empty bed as if the girl might wake at last. She whispered lullabies to the silence, her lips trembling with grief. Every creak of wood, every rattle of shutters felt to her like the child queen's ghost moving through the palace. She clutched the rosary tighter, each bead a memory, each prayer a fragment of mourning. Archbishop Ramiro did not falter. He filled the halls with sermons of obedience, of sacrifice, of God's will. He spoke of crowns and bloodlines, as though his voice alone could erase what had been done. Yet when he lifted the jewelled cross, some swore they saw his hands tremble. The man who had bound her life in vows now bound her death in silence. For every prayer he spoke in public, he killed a truth in private. The whispers of the court never reached his lips. To him, silence was sanctity. And so he buried her story beneath words of iron. Lord Martin wrote ceaselessly, treaties, petitions, decrees. He filled parchment with the daily pulse of Navarre's politics. But Elvira's death became only a line. Her Majesty expired in late summer. No heir. No mention of her age. No mention of the torn veil. No mention of the screams that had shaken the stones. His ink spared her no dignity, but his silence spared the dynasty its shame. He buried her not in earth, but in paper. And history, written by his hand, remembered the crown, but not the girl who bore it. Autumn winds roared across the courtyard one evening as Aldara stood alone. She held Elvira's torn veil in her hands, the fabric frayed, stained, ghostly. She lifted it once more and the wind seized it from her grasp. The veil rose into the air, twisting, billowing before vanishing beyond the palace walls. Aldara fell to her knees, watching as it drifted beyond reach. To her it was as though Elvira herself had broken free at last. A child queen carried not by duty, not by silence, but by the wind. Sancho saw it too from his balcony. The veil caught in the autumn light, a pale spectre against the darkening sky. His hands tightened on the stone railing. For the first time his lips parted, but no words escaped. Only breath, only memory. He turned away, but the image clung to him. The veil torn, carried off, as if mocking the crown that bound him still. Ramiro, in the chapel below, paused in his sermon as the veil fluttered past the high windows. The congregation gasped. He steadied his voice, yet for a moment the words tangled on his tongue. Even he could not silence the sight of it, a fragment of innocence escaping the chains of vows and crowns. Martin recorded none of this. His quill scratched steadily, writing of taxes, alliances, royal hunts. The veil did not exist in ink. Elvira did not exist in ink. Only silence filled the pages. And so the palace moved forward, but the echo remained. The courtyards carried whispers when the winds turned cold. The halls groaned at night as if remembering her cries. The veil of silence never left, but within it lived the memory of a girl buried before her time. Elvira was gone, yet her absence weighed heavier than her presence had ever been. Sancho bore the crown, Aldara bore the grief, Ramiro bore the sermons, Martin bore the record, but none bore the truth. The crown of Navarre shone bright in the eyes of history, but behind that shine, the torn veil drifted still, carried on the wind, a ghostly reminder of a child queen who never had the chance to live.